The East Pasture gate had been padlocked for 6 years when Grace Norris rode onto the Bancroft ranch on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882. And the first thing she noticed about it was not the rust on the iron chain or the way the wild grass had grown up through the wooden slats. It was the way Thomas Bancroft's entire body went rigid the moment her eyes landed on it, as though her gaze alone had struck him somewhere deep and unhealed. She had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, 3 days prior on the Santa Fe Railway, stepping off the train with a single trunk, a carpet bag, a good wool coat that was already too warm for the southwestern spring, and the kind of careful composure that women learned when they had been looked over and assessed and found wanting too many times in their lives. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a failed Kansas wheat farmer, and she had answered Thomas Bancroft's advertisement in the Topeka Commonwealth because she had read it 4 times and could not stop thinking about it. The advertisement had been brief, as such things went. A rancher, 40 acres, good water, decent house, seeking a capable woman of honest character for the purpose of matrimony and partnership. No reply required unless serious. She had been serious. She had also been out of options, though she would not have said that to anyone, least of all herself. Thomas Bancroft was 31 years old, and when he met her at the Cimarron station he had taken off his hat and held it in both hands and said, "Miss Norris, I am glad you made the journey," and she had thought, this is a man who means what he says. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked the land every day without ceremony, his face browned by the sun, and carrying the kind of quiet that was not coldness, but was instead the careful stillness of someone who had learned to hold things in. He had dark hair going just slightly at the temples, and eyes the color of weathered pine, and he shook her hand with the formality of someone who understood what it meant to ask a woman to uproot her life and come to a strange place. He had a foreman named Hector Reyes, a stocky Mexican man in his 40s with a generous laugh and an honest way of looking at people, and a hired hand called Pete Dunnigan who was young and gap-toothed and talked constantly when he was nervous, which appeared to be most of the time. The ranch itself was called the Double B, and it sat in a wide valley with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising to the east and the land rolling out to the west in long brown and gold waves that Grace found unexpectedly beautiful. The house was stone-built and solid, 2 stories, with a covered porch facing south and a kitchen that had good light through tall windows. Thomas had made an effort. She could see that plainly. The floors were swept. There were curtains at the windows that someone, likely Hector's wife, Rosaria, who lived a half-mile down the road, had made from flour sack material and hung with care. There was a tin of coffee on the kitchen shelf and a fresh loaf of bread on the table, and a small jar of wildflowers that was so clearly an afterthought, so clearly placed by a man who did not usually put flowers on a table but had thought perhaps he should, that Grace had to look away from it quickly before the feeling that rose in her chest gave her away. She was not a sentimental woman, or she had worked very hard not to be. Sentimentality had not served her well. Her mother had been a sentimental woman and had cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years after Grace's father lost the farm, and Grace had decided somewhere around the age of 17 that practicality was a more useful garment than feeling. But the flowers in the jar undid something in her that she could not quite put back together. The first 3 days she spent learning the rhythm of the ranch. She cooked, which she was good at, and she took inventory of the root cellar and the smokehouse with the efficient attention of a woman who had managed a household since she was 12. Thomas was courteous and measured and slightly too careful around her, as though she were something fragile or perhaps something that might bolt if startled, and she found herself wanting to tell him that she was not fragile and she was not going to bolt. She had come here deliberately. She intended to stay. On the 4th morning, a Tuesday, the light was clean and pale gold, and she had risen early and walked out to see the land properly alone, without the slight tension of being new in someone else's space. She walked the fence line of the south pasture, then the north, watching the way the Sangre de Cristos caught the rising light and turned the color of old copper and rose, and she was circling back toward the house when she came around the corner of the big red barn and saw it. The east pasture gate was iron-framed wood, double-wide, built for driving cattle through, and it was secured with a padlock and chain that had gone dark with age. The grass in the east pasture beyond it was higher than the other pastures, not dramatically so, but enough that she could see it had not been grazed in some time. The gate itself had a quality of deliberate abandonment, which was different from ordinary neglect. Someone had put that lock there on purpose and had left it there on purpose, and there was something about the way the land behind it sat, undisturbed, almost reverential in its quietness, that made Grace stop and simply look for a long moment. She did not hear Thomas come up behind her. He was that kind of quiet. She only knew he was there when she heard him stop walking, and she turned and found him standing perhaps 10 feet away with his coffee cup in his hand and his morning expression, which she had begun to catalogue, the not-yet-awake openness he had at dawn before the day built up its walls, and the moment her eyes went from the gate back to him, everything in him changed. His body went still in a way that was not relaxed stillness. His face closed, not with hostility but with pain. It was a very clear, very legible pain, and it was there and then it was gone, and he turned and walked back toward the house without saying anything. Grace stood there for a moment, looking at the gate and then at the place where Thomas had been, and she thought, all right, there is something there. She did not push it that morning. She had not been raised by a sentimental woman for nothing. The days settled into a pattern, as days do on a working ranch, and Grace discovered that she liked the work more than she had expected to. She liked the early mornings and the smell of the land and the way the mountains changed color through the day. She liked Rosaria Reyes, who came twice a week and was warm and funny, and talked about her children and her garden and the gossip of Cimarron with equal enthusiasm, and who looked at Grace with an appraising but ultimately approving eye and said one afternoon, "You have good hands. You will do well here." Grace had not been sure whether she meant ranch work or Thomas or the whole project of making a life in a new place, and she had not asked, but she had thought about it. She liked Pete Dunnigan too, in the way one likes a puppy, with affectionate exasperation. He called her Miss Norris with great ceremony even after she asked him 3 times to call her Grace, and he knocked something over at least once a meal whenever he ate at the main house, and he was deeply, obviously, hopelessly in love with Rosaria's eldest daughter, Alina, who was 19 and entirely aware of it, and handled it with a composed amusement that Grace found admirable. Thomas she was still working out. He was attentive without being intrusive. He asked her opinions and listened to the answers. He was never anything less than courteous, and he worked harder than any man she had ever seen, up before the sun and often not inside until after dark, and there was in him a fundamental decency that she recognized and respected. But there was also the closedness, the careful distance he kept between what he did and what he felt, and Grace, who understood closedness, understood that it usually had a reason. He had written in his advertisement decent house and good water, and had not mentioned that the land was extraordinary, that at certain times of day the light on the valley made something ache in your chest in the best possible way. She did not know if he had left it out because he took it for granted or because he thought beauty was not a practical selling point. She suspected the former but was not sure. 2 weeks after her arrival, she was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices outside, not angry, but excited, and she wiped her hands and went to the door to see Thomas and Hector standing by the fence with a horse Grace had not seen before, a big paint mare with a wild eye and a cut on her left front leg that had been roughly bandaged. Thomas was running his hand down the horse's neck and talking to her in a low, continuous murmur that was nothing like the way he talked to people, and Grace stood in the doorway and watched him and felt something shift in her chest like ground settling after a rain. Later, when Hector had gone and the horse had been settled in the far stall and Thomas came in for supper, he was different. Not dramatically different, but something in him was loosened. He told her about the horse, a stray, no brand, probably spooked and run some distance. And he talked about it with a naturalness that he did not usually bring to conversation with her. And Grace listened and asked questions, and he answered them. And for the first time since she arrived, the table between them felt like a table people sat at together rather than a surface they were being careful across. "You are good with horses," she said. He looked at her sideways, which was a look she was beginning to recognize as the one he used when something surprised him, but he did not want to show it. "I grew up with them," he said. "I grew up with wheat," she said, "and I am not particularly good with it." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite thing he had produced a few times previously, and the sound of it was so warm and genuine that she had to focus very deliberately on her plate for a moment to keep her own expression from doing something foolish. That evening after supper, he showed her the rest of the ranch, the part she had not seen yet, the creek that ran along the eastern edge, cold and clear, fed from the mountains, the old apple orchard that Hector kept up and that would bloom in another few weeks, the high ground at the north corner of the property where the view opened out, and you could see 30 miles in 3 directions. He talked about the land with a love that was more evident than any other feeling she had seen from him, and she thought, here is where he lives. Here is the real thing. Standing on that north rise with the evening coming down gold and purple over the mountains, she said, "Why did you put an advertisement in a Kansas paper?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley. "Because I could not go on the way things were," he said, "and I did not know how to change them except to change something large." It was the most honest thing he had said to her directly, and she understood it completely, because it was exactly why she had answered the advertisement, and she nodded and said, "Yes, that I understand." They walked back to the house in the blue dusk, and she thought, "I could love this man." The thought did not frighten her, which surprised her a little. It should have, perhaps. She was very far from home in a territory that was still, in many places, genuinely dangerous, in an arrangement that was almost entirely without guarantee, with a man who was still largely a closed door. But the thought came, and she let it come, and she put it in the back of her mind where she could look at it later and see what she thought. 3 weeks after her arrival, a man named Cyrus Holden came to the ranch. He arrived in mid-morning on a good horse, better than you would expect from the look of him, and he had the manner of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and had a prepared argument for any objection. He wore a good hat and a silver watch chain, and introduced himself as a land buyer from Raton, and he was interested, he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, in the east pasture. Thomas received him on the porch with a courtesy that was entirely formal and not in any way warm. He listened to what the man had to say with that still, careful face, and then he said that the east pasture was not for sale, and it was not going to be. Holden smiled again and said he was prepared to be generous, and Thomas said the land was not for sale at any price, and he thanked him for his time, and the whole exchange had the compressed tension of something that had happened before, that had some history Grace was not privy to. After Holden rode off down the road toward town, Thomas stood on the porch for a long moment and then went to the barn without saying anything, and Grace, who had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window, went back to her bread dough and thought about what she had seen. That evening she asked him about it carefully, not directly, the way you approach a horse that has been frightened, not head-on but at an angle, letting it know you mean well. She said, "Has that man come before?" And Thomas said yes, twice in the last 2 years. She said, "He seems very interested in that particular pasture." And Thomas said, his voice even and without apparent feeling, "He is." She did not ask why. She waited. After a silence that stretched long enough that she thought he would not say anything more, he said, "The creek runs through the east pasture. If someone controlled that water, they could put pressure on every other ranch in this valley." Grace understood at once. She had grown up in cattle country, even if she had grown up farming, and water in the arid West was not just a resource, it was leverage. She said, "And you will never sell it?" "No," he said, with a flatness that was absolute and final, and carried under it something she could not quite identify, but that was older and more personal than land rights and water access. She did not push further, and he did not offer more, and they finished supper in a quiet that was not uncomfortable but was full of things unsaid. And Grace lay awake that night in the upstairs bedroom, listening to the wind come down off the mountains, and thinking about the padlocked gate and the man who would not sell the pasture behind it. April turned into May, and the land came alive with a ferocity that Grace had not been prepared for, not having been this far south before. The apple trees in Hector's orchard bloomed in white and pale pink, and the grass on the hills went a startling, vivid green, and wildflowers appeared in the draws, and along the creek bank in colors so bright they seemed almost theatrical. The mountains still carried snow on the high peaks, but the valley was warm by mid-morning, and the evenings were long and luminous and scented with sage and apple blossom. Thomas and Grace had arrived at a functional working partnership in the week since her arrival. She ran the house and the kitchen garden she had started with Rosaria's help, and she helped with accounts and correspondence, which she turned out to be significantly better at than Thomas, who wrote with evident effort and liked numbers less than she did. He taught her to ride properly, which she had done before but not well, taking her out on a steady bay gelding named Porter in the South Pasture evenings, and correcting her seat and her hands with a patience that surprised her. She liked riding lessons best of all the things they did together, because they were practical and there was always something to do and talk about. And in the doing and the talking, the stiff formality that still sometimes appeared between them dissolved, and he talked to her like he talked to Hector, which was naturally and directly, and without the overlay of consideration that she suspected had something to do with treating her as though she were made of something breakable. One evening near the end of May, she pushed Porter into a canter without waiting for Thomas's instruction, and he cantered after her, and they went the length of the South Pasture flat out, horses stretching and the warm wind coming hard against her face. And when they pulled up at the far fence, she was laughing, genuinely laughing, which she had not done at full volume in a long time, and Thomas was beside her with his horse pulled to a stop, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Something unguarded and wondering, and she saw it for a full moment before he realized she could see it and looked away. She thought about that expression for several days afterward. The situation with Cyrus Holden resolved itself, or rather it escalated and then resolved, the way many things in the New Mexico territory resolved themselves in the spring of 1882. Holden came back a third time in late May, this time with two men who stayed back on their horses and said nothing, but were clearly meant to be noticed. He made Thomas a significantly larger offer, and Thomas declined it with the same finality as before, and then Holden said something that made the whole tenor of the exchange change, something Grace could not hear from the kitchen window, and Thomas stepped off the porch and got very close to Holden's horse, and said something quietly that made Holden's expression shift from the practiced cordiality to something wary, and then Holden backed his horse up and left. That night Hector stayed for supper, and the three of them talked about Holden with a practical directness that Grace found clarifying. Holden had tried to buy out 2 other ranches in the valley in the past year, Hector said. One of them, old Morrison's place at the valley's south end, had agreed under what Hector described with diplomatic vagueness as considerable pressure, and Morrison had moved his family to Santa Fe. The implication was clear enough without being elaborated. He cannot actually do much, Thomas said. This is not his land and it will not be. He has money, Hector said, not disagreeing but qualifying. So do I, Thomas said, which was apparently news to Hector based on his expression, and Thomas added with a quiet that was actually rather formidable, enough to be a problem for him if he wants to press it. After Hector went home, Grace washed the dishes and Thomas dried them, which was not their usual arrangement but had developed without either of them specifically deciding it, and she said, "Are you really all right?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That is not actually an answer," she said. "It is just a word." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have been dealing with men like Holden my whole life. They go away when they find that you are not afraid of them and you are not going to move." He will go away. She believed him. There was a quality in Thomas, under all the quiet, that was in fact quite difficult to move, like a large stone that had settled into the earth. She had noticed it early, and she thought it was one of the things she most admired about him. "Your land means a great deal to you," she said. He set down the pan he had been drying and looked at the window for a moment, and then he said, "My father built this ranch. He came out here from Virginia after the war with nothing but what he could carry, and he spent 20 years making this. He died here. It is where I intend to die. No one is going to take it." She understood then that it was not just about water rights and leverage and economics. She understood it was about faith and grief, and the kind of promise you make to the dead that you intend to keep no matter what it costs you. "I will help you keep it," she said. He looked at her then directly, and she held his gaze, and there was a moment between them that was not quite spoken but was nonetheless very clear, a moment of mutual recognition. And then he said, "Thank you, Grace," with a simplicity that was somehow more affecting than anything ornate could have been, and she turned back to the dishes so neither of them had to manage what was in the room just then. The first day of June was hot and still, and Grace woke with the dawn and could not go back to sleep. She lay in the warm bed and listened to the mockingbird that had taken up residence in the apple tree outside the east window, and thought about what she was building here and what she was becoming, and who Thomas Bancroft actually was when you put all the pieces together. She was in love with him. She had known it for perhaps 2 weeks and had been deciding whether to acknowledge it even to herself, because acknowledgement created a kind of obligation, and she was not certain what she was going to do with it. He had not given her any indication, or he had given her many indications that were each individually arguable, each one defensible as simple courtesy or habitual care, but nothing that was clear. She was not afraid of saying things directly, had never been afraid of it, but she was afraid of misreading something important, afraid of taking what was gratitude or loneliness or simple proximity and calling it something it was not. She got up and dressed and went down to start coffee, and it was in the kitchen, looking out the window at the morning, that she made up her mind to ask him about the gate. She had been thinking about the gate since that first morning. In the month she had been on the Double B, she had walked every fence line and learned every part of the property except the east pasture. She had begun to understand that the gate was the center of something, the keyhole to a room in Thomas Bancroft that she could see through the cracks but had not entered, and she thought that if she was going to love this man, and she was going to have to ask. She made the coffee and made biscuits, and when Thomas came in from the barn, sleeves rolled and hair still damp from the pump, and poured himself a cup and stood at the window the way he always did first thing, she said, "Thomas." He looked at her. "I want to ask you about the east pasture gate," she said. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to answer, and she watched him and did not look away, and then he set down his coffee cup on the kitchen table and said, "All right." He did not hesitate. She had half expected hesitation, had prepared herself for it, had been ready to say something reassuring about not needing to know, not needing to push, but he said all right, and he meant it, and she saw in the set of his shoulders the same quality she had seen when he stepped off the porch toward Holden's horse, the quality of a man who has decided. He led her out of the kitchen and across the yard and around the big barn, and they walked together through the morning to the east pasture gate, and he reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a key that he carried there, had been carrying there for 6 years, apparently, this small iron key that fit the padlock, and he turned it in the lock and the chain fell free. He pulled the gate open, both sides, and it swung back on its old hinges with a sound like a long breath let out, and they walked through together into the east pasture. The grass was long and green and full of wildflowers, blue and yellow and red, undisturbed for 6 years, and the creek ran along the far edge in the shade of the cottonwoods, and in the middle of the pasture, set back from the gate perhaps 100 yards, there was a small stone marker. Not a headstone, not exactly, but a flat stone placed upright in the earth with a name carved into it and a date. Grace walked to it and read what was carved there. Clara Bancroft, June 3, 1876. And below the name and date, smaller, 3 words. She loved this. She stood in front of the marker and felt the morning around her, the warmth of the early sun and the sound of the creek and the wildflowers moving in a small breeze. And she understood now what she was looking at. She understood the 6 years of the locked gate and the key carried in a pocket, and the way the pasture had been left alone and had grown into something unintended and beautiful. Thomas stood beside her, not close but alongside, and when she looked at him, he was looking at the marker with an expression that was both grief and something else, something that had moved out of pure grief into something more mixed, more present. "Your wife," Grace said quietly. "Yes," he said. "How?" "Fever," he said. "It was very fast, 3 days." He was quiet for a moment. "She loved this pasture. She used to come out here in the evenings and sit by the creek. She said it was the best part of the ranch." He stopped. "I put the marker here because it was where she was happiest. I locked the gate because I could not stand to put cattle in here and have them walk over it. And then I just left it." He looked at the stone. 6 years is a long time to leave a gate locked. "Or not so long," Grace said, "depending on what is on the other side of it." He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and there was something happening in his eyes that she recognized because she had felt it herself many times in the last month, the slow and somewhat alarming dissolution of the careful distance she had been maintaining. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have approved of you entirely." "On what basis?" Grace asked, and her voice was steady but only just. "Because you asked," he said. She always said that the only way to know what is true is to ask and then listen to the whole answer, not just the part that is comfortable. Grace looked down at the marker and then back at Thomas, and she said, "I am sorry you lost her." "I know," he said, and she could hear that he believed it, that he understood she meant it genuinely. "And I think," Grace said carefully, looking at the wildflowers growing around the stone, "that she would approve of the flowers." He looked down and seemed to see them, perhaps truly see them, for the first time, and something in his face eased, something that had been held tense for a very long time. They stood in the east pasture for a while longer, the sun climbing and the creek running and the flowers vivid in the morning light, and it was not a sad thing, Grace found. It was not painful. It was more like being allowed into a room that had been dark and finding that it was, in fact, full of light. On the walk back to the house, Thomas said, "I should have done this a long time ago." "You did it when you were ready," Grace said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I needed someone to ask." She thought about that. "Maybe both," she said, and he looked at her sideways with that particular look she had come to recognize and value, the surprised one, and he said, "Yes, maybe both." After that, something changed. It changed the way a season changes, not in a single moment but in an accumulation of moments, each one small and each one part of something larger. Thomas talked more. Not that he had been silent before, but there was a difference now between the talking and the real talking, and what he offered in the evenings over supper or on the porch in the long light of June was the real kind. He told her about his father, the man who had come from Virginia with nothing, and built the ranch from bare land and will and stubbornness. And he told her about growing up here, riding these hills as a boy, learning the land the way he learned his own hands. He told her about the years right after Clara died, the years that had been very bad, not in a way that asked for sympathy, but simply in a way that was honest. He said he had not been a very good man in those years, by which he meant he had withdrawn from people and from the land and from everything that required him to be present in his own life, and Hector had kept the ranch running while he was not capable of doing it himself, and he owed Hector more than he could ever repay. Grace told him about Kansas, about the farm that had been her whole world until it was not, and the years after that in Topeka, where she had worked as a seamstress, and then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant, and had been essentially invisible. a capable and unremarkable woman who moved through the world without leaving much impression on it, and how that had begun to feel like a kind of slow death, being invisible, and how she had seen his advertisement and thought, here is someone who needs a person. And I am a person who needs to be needed, and perhaps that is enough to begin with. Thomas listened to this with the complete attention he gave everything, and when she finished he said, "You are not invisible," and she said, "I know that now," and they looked at each other across the table and neither of them looked away. On the 14th of June, which was a warm and cloudless Wednesday, Rosaria Reyes came to the house with a bundle of things for the kitchen garden, and a large pot of parcel and news that Cyrus Holden had been seen leaving Raton heading south, with his men and his horses and considerable luggage, in what appeared to be a permanent departure. The word from town, Rosaria said with satisfaction, was that a group of valley ranchers had retained a lawyer in Santa Fe and presented certain documents regarding water rights and prior land claims, and Holden's legal position had turned out to be considerably less solid than he had presented, and he had decided discretion was the better part of continuing to invest in what was apparently not going to be a profitable venture. Thomas, who had said he had enough money to be a problem, had apparently been part of funding the legal action, though he did not mention this himself, and Grace only found it out later from Hector, who said it with the particular combination of pride and exasperation of a man who has spent 2 decades watching someone do necessary things in a complicated way. "He does not like to ask for help," Hector said, "but he will spend a great deal of money solving a problem that affects other people as much as himself, and he will not mention it." Grace filed this information under what she was learning about Thomas Bancroft, and thought it illuminated several things she had been wondering about. The evening after they heard about Holden's departure, Thomas came home from the North Range in better spirits than she had seen him, and he went to the creek and washed up and came to supper with his hair still wet and his sleeves rolled, and she put the parcel on the table and sat down, and he said, "The apple trees are setting good fruit this year." "They are," Grace said. "Hector says by September we will have more than we can use. We used to make cider and sell it in town." Clara had a cider press she had found at an estate sale in Taos. He stopped. "I believe it is still in the back of the barn. I had not thought about it in years." "I would like to see it," Grace said. "I will find it," he said, "and we will make cider in September if you want to." "I want to," she said. He looked at her and she at him, and the June evening came through the open windows, and she thought, say something, say what is true. She had spent a month thinking it and 2 weeks fully knowing it, and she was not a woman who sat on true things indefinitely. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "I am glad I answered your advertisement," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I, more than I expected to be." "And how much did you expect?" she asked, because she was Grace Norris and she did not stop halfway. He looked at her with that expression, the wondering one, the one he had started showing her when he stopped being careful. "Not enough," he said. "Not nearly enough." She smiled at him, and he looked at his bowl and then back at her, and she said, "Well then, we have agreed on something." "We have agreed on several things," he said, and there was a new color in his voice, something light and warm and faintly surprised at itself, and she thought, "Yes, there it is. That is what I was waiting for." 2 days later he kissed her. They were at the apple orchard, she and Thomas and Rosaria, looking at the set fruit on the branches, and Rosaria had gone back toward the house, and Thomas and Grace stood under one of the old trees in the dappled shade, and he said, "Grace," the way he had been saying her name lately, with a particularity that made it sound entirely different from any way it had been said before, and she turned to him, and he took her face in both hands with the carefulness of someone handling something precious, and kissed her. It was a careful kiss, and then it was not, and the orchard was warm around them, and the mountains stood over everything in the clean blue morning, and she thought, "This is mine. This man, this land, this life. This is mine, and I am his, and we chose each other, which is the finest kind of belonging there is." He pulled back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and his hands were still at her face, and she reached up and put her hands over his and held them there. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said. "I know," she said. "Was that apparent?" he asked, with a trace of something that was almost mortification. "Not to someone who was not paying attention," she said. "But I was paying attention." "Were you always this observant?" he asked. "No," she said. "I became more so when I had reason to be." He understood what she meant. She could tell from the way the mortification went away and something else took its place, something warmer and more settled. And he kissed her again, this time without the carefulness, and she thought, yes, that is it exactly. Thomas and Grace did not rush into the formal business of their arrangement becoming a marriage in the way of some people who treat the contract as the point. They had already been sharing a life for nearly 2 months. The contract was a formality they moved toward with mutual agreement and without drama. And on the 22nd of June, they drove into Cimarron in the wagon and were married at the courthouse by the county clerk, with Hector and Rosaria Reyes as witnesses and Pete Dunnigan standing outside the door trying not to cry and mostly failing. The wedding dinner was at the Reyes house, loud and warm and full of Rosaria's food and Hector's approval, and the Reyes children running through the yard, and Pete Dunnigan, who had been to town that morning, and returned with a bottle of decent whiskey which he presented to Thomas with great ceremony. And Thomas poured it, and they toasted with the kind of sincere simplicity that made Grace feel the occasion was being honored exactly right. On the drive home in the summer night, the mountains dark against the stars and the road pale in the moonlight, Thomas drove and Grace sat beside him, and he had one hand on the reins and the other hand he held out, and she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they went home like that through the beautiful dark. It was not a fairy story, and she did not think of it as one. It was better than a fairy story. It was a real thing, assembled from real material, and it fit her in a way she had not known a life could fit a person until she had one that did. The summer was full and warm, and the work of the ranch was constant, and Grace discovered things about herself that she had not had occasion to discover in a rented room in Topeka. She discovered that she was good at cattle, which surprised her. Not at the riding and roping part, though she was improving rapidly under Thomas's continued teaching, but at the management of it, the grazing rotation and the condition assessment, and the record-keeping that was now entirely in her hands, and that she had organized into a system that Hector called a miracle, and that Thomas looked at with undisguised admiration. She discovered that she loved the mountains in a way that was almost irrational, that the sight of the Sangre de Cristos at evening, when they did what their name suggested and turned the color of blood and gold and gave back to the sky everything the day had given them, made something in her chest open up and breathe. She had not known she was the kind of person who could be moved by landscape. Perhaps she had not been before. Perhaps Thomas had opened that up too, the way he had opened the gate. She and Thomas developed a language between them, which is what long-associated people do, a shorthand of looks and half-sentences and particular silences, and she could tell from the way he moved in the morning what kind of day it was going to be, and he could tell from the way she set the table at dinner what she was thinking. And sometimes in the evenings on the porch she would look out at the valley and he would be looking at it too, and they would say nothing, and it was entirely sufficient. He was a good man. This was not a small thing. She had known enough men who were not, or who were good in the narrow sense of not being actively harmful but who were careless with the people around them in ways that accumulated into damage, and Thomas was not like that. He was good in the attentive way, the way that noticed and remembered and considered. He brought her things. Not grand things. A particular kind of calico she had admired at the general store. A book of poems that Rosaria had mentioned she liked. A small blue-gray stone he had found by the creek that was perfectly flat and round, and had some quality of smoothness that made you want to hold it in your hand. He left these things on the kitchen table or the porch railing without ceremony or expectation, and she always found them and always knew what they meant. In late July, something happened that Thomas had not told her was possible, but that she thought, looking back, he had been quietly hoping for. The stray paint mare, who had been recovering in the far stall and had gone from wild-eyed and frightened to cautiously trusting under Thomas's daily attention, showed signs one morning of being in foal. Hector examined her and confirmed it, and Thomas came in to lunch with the kind of happiness that was almost boyish, that made him look younger than she usually saw him, and she thought, this is a man who loves things. He had just learned to keep that love out of sight. He was learning to let it show again. She put her hand on his face that afternoon just briefly as he was sitting at the table going over the ledger, not for any reason except that she wanted to, and he looked up at her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she thought her heart might embarrass her. "What was that for?" he asked. "No reason," she said. "Do I need a reason?" He shook his head slowly, looking at her. "No," he said. "No, you do not." On the 1st of August, Grace woke very early with a knowledge that was so certain and so new that she lay in the still dark and held it to herself like something warm before she let herself fully acknowledge it. She waited a week, and then she told Thomas over breakfast, quietly, watching his face. He was still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and stood up from the table and pulled her up with him, both hands, and held her for a long time without saying anything, his face against her hair, and she could feel the quality of what he was feeling, the joy and the fear and the fierce protectiveness of it. And she understood all of it and felt it too. "You are all right," he said into her hair. "I am very all right," she said. "And are you happy?" he said, pulling back to look at her. "I am happy," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her, and she thought perhaps she had never seen anyone look quite that happy and quite that frightened at the same time. And she thought that was exactly right. That was what it should look like. And she kissed him, and he held her tighter. And outside the window the morning was going gold over the mountains, and the mockingbird in the apple tree was singing. September came, and the apples came down from the trees in heavy abundance, red and gold. And Thomas found the cider press in the back of the barn under a canvas, and cleaned it up and repaired one of the wooden paddles. And they pressed cider together on a warm Saturday. She and Thomas and Hector and Rosaria and their children and Pete Dunnigan, who had by this time, in an act of considerable courage, asked Elena Reyes to walk with him, and had been accepted, and who was now conducting himself with the dazed happiness of someone who could not entirely believe his luck. The cider was excellent. Thomas tried the first cup and said it was better than he remembered, and Rosaria said that was because he had someone to make it with now, which was either about the cider or not about the cider, and she said it with the look that made both interpretations equally valid. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Thomas and Grace sat on the porch in the September dark with cups of cider, and the mountains were vast and starlit, and the valley below was all cricket song and warm air and the smell of pressed apples. And she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and she thought, "I came here with a trunk and a carpet bag and a wool coat too warm for the weather, and I could not have imagined this. I could not have invented this." She was glad she had not tried. Reality had done considerably better than invention. "Thomas," she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right." "When I first arrived," she said, "I thought I was being practical. I told myself I was being practical. I needed a place and a life, and you were offering both. But I was not being practical. I was being hopeful, and I had forgotten that I was a hopeful person." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What made you hopeful?" "The jar of flowers on the kitchen table," she said. He was silent again for longer this time, and she smiled in the dark because she knew that expression even if she could not see it in the dark, the sidelong surprised one, and she could feel it. "That was Rosaria's idea," he said. "I know," Grace said, "but you listened to it." He pulled her a little closer, and she could feel him smile, feel the movement of it where her head rested against his shoulder, and he said, "I am very glad you were hopeful." "So am I," she said. On an October morning, a morning of cold, clear air and the aspens going gold on the mountain slopes, Thomas walked out to the east pasture alone at first light. Grace watched him from the bedroom window, watched him unlock the gate. He unlocked it every morning now, leaving it open through the day, only locking it again in the evenings, a ritual she had not commented on because she understood it. It was not a keeping out but a keeping safe, and walked through the long grass to the stone marker. He stood there for a few minutes in the gold morning, in the wind coming down off the mountains. He had told her about Clara more over the weeks, not compulsively or obsessively, but naturally, the way you talk about someone who mattered. Clara had been from Texas, had been funny and sharp and difficult about things she considered important, had loved this particular pasture because you could see 3 distinct mountain peaks from the spot by the creek. Had been 24 when she died, which was too young, which would always be too young, and Thomas had been 25 and had spent the next 6 years making himself very small against the grief of it. Grace had no conflict about Clara. She had thought she might, had been prepared to, but she did not. Clara had been real and had been loved and had died, and those 3 facts deserved acknowledgement and respect. Thomas, having loved someone before her and lost her, did not diminish what they had. It was just part of who he was, and she loved who he was entirely. She watched him come back from the east pasture, through the gate, closing it behind him, and she thought he walked differently than he had when she arrived. He walked like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a long time, not the love. She did not think you ever put down the love, but the weight of the closed gate, the weight of the 6 years of absence. He walked like a man who was present in his own life again. He came into the kitchen and she was at the stove, and he came up behind her and put both arms around her, and she leaned back into him, her hands still on the stove. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said into her hair. "Biscuits in 10 minutes, she said. "That is excellent news," he said, and she laughed, and he laughed too. And outside the October morning was cold and gold, and the mountains were on fire with autumn. November brought the first real cold and the first snow on the high peaks, and Grace, who was now visibly pregnant and felt enormous, though Thomas consistently and emphatically told her she was beautiful, developed a habit of sitting by the kitchen fire in the evenings with the mending or the ledger books while Thomas read or went over the ranch plans. And the comfortable domestic intimacy of these evenings was something she had not anticipated and valued deeply. Pete Dunnigan, who had finally learned to call her Grace after she told him for the 6th time that Miss Norris was her mother and her mother had been dead for 3 years, and she would prefer not to be addressed as a dead woman, had asked Hector formally for permission to court Alina, which he had done with such elaborate solemnity that Hector had reportedly needed to leave the room for several minutes before he could respond without laughing. Alina herself had been waiting for this with patience of a woman who fully understands the situation, but is allowing the man involved to arrive at the obvious conclusion at his own pace. Thomas told Grace this at supper, and she said, "He finally asked," and Thomas said, "He spent 2 weeks working himself up to it," and Grace said, "Alina is a very patient woman," and Thomas said, "She takes after her mother," which was both true and a testament to Rosaria Reyes, who had managed Hector for 23 years with a combination of warmth and unbudgeable resolve that Grace greatly admired. The winter on the Double B was harder than the autumn, but full of its own pleasures. The snow came down into the valley, and the world went white and quiet, and the mountains were severe and magnificent, and there was something about the enforced closeness of the long, cold evenings that Grace found entirely to her liking. She and Thomas knew each other well now, with the knowing that comes from months of daily proximity, from having been afraid together and glad together and exhausted together, and from having navigated the dozen small and large negotiations that make up a shared life. She knew he drank his coffee too hot and always burned his tongue. He knew she could not read at a table without needing to read passages aloud. She knew when he was thinking through a problem versus when he was genuinely at ease. He knew every expression she had for the weather and for Holden's departure and for apple cider and for him, and she knew this because of the way his face moved when they occurred. One January evening when the snow was coming down in large soft flakes and the fire was very warm and she was attempting to be comfortable in a rocking chair which was becoming increasingly complicated, Thomas set down the book he had been reading and said, "What name do you like for a boy?" She looked up from the ledger. "I have been thinking about James," she said. He considered this. "James Bancroft," he said. "That is good." "Your father's name was Robert," she said, and she saw what that did to his face. "We could say James Robert." He was quiet for a moment. "That is very good," he said. "That is exactly right." She went back to the ledger and he went back to his book, and the snow fell outside and the fire was warm and it was exactly right. On the 3rd of February, 1883, James Robert Bancroft came into the world with considerable fuss and considerable volume in the upstairs bedroom of the Double B Ranch house, attended by Rosaria Reyes, and a physician from Cimarron who arrived with 12 minutes to spare and declared afterward that mother and son were in excellent health, and the infant had a highly developed pair of lungs. Thomas was downstairs for the labor, a state of affairs that was conventional and that he endured very badly. Hector came and sat with him because Hector was a good man and a good friend, and he later told Grace that Thomas had paced the full length of the parlor approximately 200 times and had drunk 4 cups of coffee, and had also, at one point, gone outside and stood in the snow for several minutes before coming back in, which Hector had found both understandable and slightly funny. When Rosaria came downstairs and said, "Thomas, you have a son, come up," he took the stairs 2 at a time, and Grace heard him coming and adjusted herself in the pillows and looked at the door. He came in with the particular expression of a man who has been frightened and is now flooded with relief and something that is too large for ordinary expressions, and he crossed to the bed and looked at the bundle she was holding, the small, wrinkled, red-faced, furiously opinionated person that was their son, and he sat down on the edge of the bed, and she could see him trying to find something adequate to say and not finding it, and she handed him the baby. He held James with the carefulness of something precious and looked down at him for a long moment, and she watched him fall in love with his son, which was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Hello," Thomas said to James very quietly. "Hello, I have been waiting for you." Grace thought she would remember that forever. She was sure she would remember it forever. The snow was falling outside the bedroom window and the fire was warm, and her husband held her son, their son, and said hello as if to someone he had been expecting and was very glad to see. James was a large and healthy infant who had opinions about everything from the first day. He did not sleep at regular intervals and was vocal about deprivation, and had from the very beginning an expression that both Grace and Thomas identified, privately and then publicly, as Thomas's particular look of careful assessment. He had Grace's coloring, fair and blue-eyed, and Thomas's ears, which Thomas was apologetic about and Grace found extremely charming. Spring returned to the valley, as it had returned the year before, and Grace thought about the morning she had arrived, and the woman she had been standing on the Cimarron platform with her trunk and her carpet bag, the careful, controlled woman who had been not hopeful and told herself she was practical. And she compared that woman to the one who stood on the porch of the Double B in the April morning, with her son on her hip and her husband beside her, and the mountains putting on their seasonal performance of impossible beauty. And she thought the improvement was significant, and she felt it in her whole body, the rightness of it, the fit of this life against the shape of her. Thomas had let the east pasture go back to natural now, with a few small changes. He had cleared a path through the long grass from the gate to Clara's marker, and he had planted a rosebush at the base of the stone, a climber that would take some years to establish itself, but that was already this spring pushing out small green shoots with intent. He went there most mornings. Not for long, a few minutes, and Grace thought it was not grief anymore, not primarily. It was more like keeping company with someone you cared about, which she thought was exactly as it should be. He opened the gate every morning and left it open through the day, and the good creek-watered grass had become summer grazing for the cattle, and Clara's marker stood in the middle of the rich green pasture surrounded by the wildflowers, and the cattle moved around it with the natural animal instinct for avoiding stones, and it looked, Grace thought, like something right, like something that had found its proper form. One morning in April, her second April on the Double B, Grace put James in Thomas's arms and walked out to the east pasture alone. She walked the path through the long grass and stood in front of Clara's stone and the climbing rose and the wildflowers, and she stood quietly for a little while. She was not sure exactly what she wanted to say or whether she wanted to say anything, but she thought that honesty was something she owed this person who had been loved by the man she loved, and she thought that she owed something to the woman who had sat in this pasture in the evenings and found it the best part of the ranch, because she understood that completely now. She said softly, "I am taking good care of him, and of this place." She looked at the mountains, vivid in the morning. "You had very good taste." The wind came through the grass and the cottonwoods along the creek murmured, and she thought, yes, all right, good. She walked back through the gate to find Thomas sitting on the fence with James on his knee, the baby earnestly attempting to grab Thomas's hat, and Thomas letting him, because Thomas, who was not outwardly the indulgent type, was thoroughly and hopelessly devoted to their son, and allowed him liberties with his hat that he would not have considered for any other purpose. "He is going to eat it," Grace said. "The hat is older than the ranch," Thomas said. "It can take it." She leaned on the fence beside him, and he shifted James to one arm and put the other arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the April morning looking at the land, which was green and gold and vivid and completely theirs. "I was thinking," Thomas said, "about getting 2 more horses. There is a man in Taos selling a good line of stock. Hector has seen them." "We have the room with the east pasture open now," Grace said. "That was my thinking exactly," he said. James produced a sound of strong opinion regarding the hat, which he had successfully gripped and was attempting to investigate with his gums. "He is going to be verbal," Grace said. "He is going to be opinionated," Thomas said. "He gets it from you." "He absolutely does not," Grace said. "Grace," Thomas said with the look. "He may get a little of it from me," she allowed. He pulled her closer, and she leaned into him, and James sat on Thomas's arm in the morning sun, hat in hand, looking out at the valley with the focused interest of someone who intends to understand the world he has arrived in, which Grace thought was exactly the right approach. Pete Dunnigan married Alina Reyes in June of 1883, in a ceremony in Cimarron that featured Rosaria's cooking, and an extraordinary amount of Hector's home-brewed beer, and Pete in a new coat that he wore with the dignity of someone who felt the occasion required it. Grace danced at the wedding, which she did well and Thomas did adequately, and James sat on Rosaria's lap and watched with the solemn attention of an 8-month-old who is taking everything in for future reference. That summer, the Bancroft ranch expanded. Thomas bought the horses from Taos, 3 of them, a bay stallion and 2 mares, and added them to the small herd he had been building since the paint mare, who was now named Cimarron, which everyone agreed suited her, had delivered her foal, a strong little filly that Thomas had already reserved for James on the general principle that a ranch boy should have a horse of his own from the beginning. The cattle operation grew as well, with the east pasture open and providing the summer grazing it had been meant to provide, and the cider in September was the best yet, and the ledger books that Grace kept were very satisfying, the kind of satisfying that came from numbers going in the right direction, which they were. She wrote to her aunt in Topeka, the one who had been her closest family, and told her about the ranch and the mountains and James, and sent a small photograph that a traveling photographer had made in Cimarron, she and Thomas and James on the porch steps, squinting slightly in the sun, looking like what they were. The aunt wrote back and said she looked happy and that Grace's mother would have been very glad, and Grace read this twice and then put the letter in the box where she kept things she wanted to keep. On a September evening when the first chill of autumn was back in the air and the aspens on the mountain were beginning to turn, She and Thomas were on the porch after James was in bed and the valley was going dark and vast and starred, and she said, "I have been thinking about the spring." "The spring generally," he said. "No. About whether James might have a sibling by next spring." Thomas was very still for a moment in the way he was still when something important was happening, and then he turned to look at her and she looked back at him in the gathering dark, and she could see him clearly even so because she knew his face completely by now, every line and expression of it. "Would you want that?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Would you?" He was quiet a moment and then he said, "Yes, very much." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the wedding night drive home, and he held it the same way he had then, folded her hand in his completely, and they sat in the dark and the cool autumn air with the stars coming out over the mountains and the valley quiet around them. "I think James needs a brother," she said. "Or a sister," Thomas said. "Or both, eventually," Grace said. "That is ambitious," Thomas said. "I have always been ambitious," she said. "I was just not always sure what for." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it, which was a thing he did sometimes, and which she found so quietly eloquent that it never failed to move her, and she looked at the mountains and thought, "This is the thing. This is the particular thing. The specificity of this man and this valley and this life assembled from a Kansas platform and an advertisement in a paper and a jar of flowers on a kitchen table and a gate that had been locked for 6 years and then was not. The gate was open now. It was open every morning, and she could see it from the kitchen window. The two have swung back against the fence posts, and the path to Clara's marker clear through the long grass, and the creek running cold and bright along the far edge, and the horses grazing in the rich grass by the cottonwoods. There was a fineness to the sight of it that she would not have been able to articulate to anyone who had not stood in front of that locked gate on a first April morning and understood what it meant. She thought Thomas must have also been looking at it from the house, all those mornings for 6 years, looking at the locked gate and the unvisited pasture and the weight of it sitting in his chest. And she thought about what it had taken for him to say all right when she asked, to put his hand in his pocket and take out the key he had been carrying for 6 years and turn it in the lock without hesitation, without making her wait for his readiness. And she thought that was the most courageous thing she had seen from him. More than the way he had faced Holden, more than the way he had rebuilt the ranch in the years alone. It was the bravest moment she knew of him, and she intended to honor it by being worthy of it for the rest of her life. She told him this later, much later, on a winter evening when James was asleep and the fire was low and they were in the familiar quiet of the parlor that they had made their own over the months and seasons. And Thomas listened to her with the full attention he always gave her, and when she finished he said, "You did not give me a reason to hesitate." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I had been carrying that key for 6 years," he said. "And in every one of those 6 years I would not have been able to open that gate, not because I could not find a reason to, but because I could not find a reason that mattered enough. And then you asked, and you were standing there in the morning in that good wool coat that was too warm for April, and I looked at you and thought, yes, this person, this is a reason." He paused. "You were the first person since Clara who made me feel like the future was worth walking toward." She was very quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas, yes, that is the most you have ever said at one time since I arrived." He looked at her for a beat and then he laughed, the full warm real laugh, and she laughed too. And the parlor was warm and the fire was low and James slept upstairs with his firm opinions about hats in his father's ears. And the mountains stood outside in the winter night, their permanence a kind of reassurance, and Grace Bancroft, who had been Grace Norris with a trunk and a carpet bag and a wool coat too warm for the weather, thought, "I am exactly where I am meant to be," which was a thing she had never been able to say before in her entire life, and which she intended to be able to say every remaining day of it. By the end of 1883, the Double B had become something she and Thomas could both be proud of in the unsentimental way of people who build things and know what it took. The ranch was in strong financial shape. The herds were healthy. The east pasture with its good creek water had become among the most productive grazing on the property, and the reputation of the Bancroft horses had spread enough that there were buyers coming regularly from Taos and Santa Fe and as far as Colorado. Hector Reyes ran the daily operations with the competence of 20 years, and the authority Thomas had formally given him and he deserved. And Pete Dunnigan, who had matured significantly since marrying Alina, had become a genuinely capable ranch hand. The community of the valley had solidified too, after the Holden business. The legal action that Thomas had helped fund had led to a more formal agreement among the valley ranchers about water rights and grazing boundaries, a cooperative arrangement that the territorial government had acknowledged in writing, and that gave the small ranchers a collective voice they had not had before. Thomas had become, without particularly seeking it, something of a central figure in this cooperation, because he had money and he had sense, and he had a wife who was very good with correspondence and whose letters to the territorial office in Santa Fe were models of clear and reasoned argument. In the spring of 1884, Grace's second April on the Double B, the climbing rose on Clara's marker bloomed for the first time. It was modest still, the bush young, but there were 6 or 7 small dark red flowers on it, and Thomas saw them on his morning walk and came back into the kitchen without speaking and picked up Grace from where she was at the stove, very carefully because she was 6 months along and there were logistical considerations, and held her. She held him back and did not ask what it was because she already knew, and outside the morning was warm and the east pasture was open, and the rose was blooming, and the mountains were beginning to show the first pale flush of spring growth on the lower slopes. And in the east pasture the wildflowers were coming back around the stone marker, blue and yellow and red, as they came back every year, as they would keep coming back. Their second child, a son as she had predicted though Thomas had gamely offered alternative possibilities, was born in July of 1884 and was named Robert Ellis Bancroft, Ellis being Grace's mother's maiden name and Robert being Thomas's father. And he arrived with less drama than James had and more hair and a disposition that was from the first day observable as fundamentally more serene than his older brothers. Though Rosaria said serenely disposed infants had a way of reassessing that position once they were mobile, which turned out to be entirely correct. James, at 18 months, examined his brother with the thorough suspicion of someone who is not sure this addition has been properly approved, and had to be won over gradually over the following weeks, which was accomplished primarily by the fact that Robert would stare at James with an expression of complete admiring fixation, and James eventually decided this was acceptable. Thomas, with his 2 sons, was something Grace observed with the steady pleasure of someone who is exactly where they want to be watching exactly what they want to see. He was the same with both of them as he was with everything he loved, attentive and steady and quietly devoted, and he held them with the same careful reverence he had shown for the stray mare, and for the land and for her. And she thought that this was the thing she had understood about him from very early on, that the depth of his feeling was proportional to the care with which he handled things, and that she and their sons were the most carefully handled things in the world to him. And she loved him entirely and without reservation for it. In the late summer of 1884, a letter arrived from a man in Virginia who turned out to be a distant cousin of Thomas's father, who had heard through some chain of correspondence that the Virginia Bancrofts had followed up on that Robert Bancroft had died and left a ranch and a son, and wanted to know if there was anything to know about the son. Thomas read this letter at the kitchen table and then read it again, and Grace watched him read it and waited. He folded it and set it on the table and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have not spoken to anyone from my father's family in 12 years. Would you like to?" Grace asked. He thought about it. She could see him think about it, which she could do now as easily as reading weather, the particular turn of expression when he was turning something over and looking at all sides of it. "I think," he said finally, "that my father would have wanted me to write back. He was not a man for severed connections." Grace took the letter and read it herself. It was from a man named Edmund Bancroft, who appeared to be a farmer and a deacon and a fairly decent writer, and who expressed his inquiry with the circumspection of someone who was not sure of the reception, but wanted to make it anyway. She thought it was a good letter. She thought it was the kind of letter that deserved an answer. "I will write it if you tell me what you want to say," she offered. Thomas looked at her with that expression again, the fond one, the one she had collected all the particular instances of over the 2.5 years she had known him. He said, "You are very good at this." "At what?" "At knowing what the right thing to do is and making it possible for it to happen." She thought about this. "I was not good at it in Kansas," she said. "I think the altitude helps." He laughed, and she smiled. And then she pulled the ink and paper from the kitchen drawer and set them on the table between them. And they wrote to Edmund Bancroft in Virginia together, Thomas finding the words and Grace shaping them into the kind of letter that said, "Come in. We are here. The door is open." 5 years after that April morning, when she had arrived at the Cimarron station with a trunk and a carpet bag, Grace Bancroft stood on the north high ground of the Double B in the early evening, and looked out over 30 miles of valley and mountain. And Thomas stood beside her with Robert on his hip and James standing at the fence rail trying to see the farthest thing he could see, as he had been doing since he learned to stand up. And she thought about beginnings. About the way they do not feel like beginnings when they are happening. About how you are too busy being afraid or hopeful or both to understand that you are in the first chapter of something. She had been afraid on the train from Topeka. She had been afraid on the platform, and she had been afraid when he walked toward her with his hat in both hands. She had been afraid the morning she asked about the gate. She was not afraid anymore, not of this. She was afraid of small things, rattlesnakes, the flash floods that came down the mountain draws in the monsoon season, James's preference for investigating heights, but not of this life, not of this man. Not of this particular good fortune that she had found by being hopeful when she had told herself she was being practical. Thomas looked at her, which he did regularly and apparently without tiring of it, and she looked back at him. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am very glad I got on that train," she said. He reached over and took her hand without looking away from her face, and the valley went golden below them, and the mountains turned the color of their name in the late light, blood and copper and rose. And James announced from the fence rail that he could see all the way to forever, which Thomas said was geographically possible from this particular spot on a clear day. "Can you really see forever from here?" Grace asked. "On a clear day," Thomas said, "something very close to it." She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and the evening came down warm and full over the whole long beautiful valley, and the Double B lay below them in the golden light with the east pasture open, and the creek running and the climbing rose on Clara's marker putting out its dark red flowers, and the horses grazing in the evening grass, and the house with its covered porch where there had been flowers on the kitchen table the first day she walked in, and all of it hers, and all of it theirs. And the future open in every direction like a gate that had been locked for 6 years, and was not locked any more, swung wide and letting in the whole wide morning.